The first headbutt sounded like a hammer hitting hollow wood. Thunk. Caleb Martin lifted his head from the engine he'd been working on, frowning. The sound came again, harder this time, followed by a rattling scrape, like something shoved its weight against a door. Thunk! Thunk! Caleb wiped grease onto his jeans and stepped out of the barn into the cold morning air. The sun had barely risen over the ridge behind his property, laying a pale stripe of light across the pasture. Frost clung to the fence rails. His breath came out in little clouds. And at the far end of the yard, by the old tin shed, his goat was trying to break down a door. Not tapping, not nudging, ramming. The goat, an adult doe named Juniper, lowered her head, stepped back 2 paces, then surged forward and slammed her forehead into the shed door with a force that made the hinges shudder. Caleb's stomach dropped. "Juniper!" he yelled, starting across the yard. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Juniper didn't even look at him. She backed up and hit it again. The shed door rattled, a loose latch clinking in protest. Juniper's hooves scraped the frozen dirt like she was winding up for a third strike. Caleb broke into a jog. Juniper wasn't a crazy goat. She was stubborn, yes, and dramatic in the way goats often were, but she wasn't destructive. She didn't smash things unless she had a reason. And right now, she looked like she had a reason that made her desperate. Caleb reached the shed and grabbed Juniper's collar strap, just as she tried to ram again. He pulled her back, bracing his boots in the dirt. "Stop!" he snapped, then softened his voice instinctively. "Hey, hey, girl, easy!" Juniper resisted, muscles taut, eyes wide and bright with agitation. She let out a low, guttural bleat that wasn't the normal "feed me" noise. It was the sound she made when something was wrong. Then she twisted her head toward Caleb, finally acknowledging him, and stared straight into his face. Not in a goat way, in a way that felt uncomfortably direct, like she was trying to transfer urgency through eye contact. Then she jerked her head toward the shed door and bleated again, short and sharp. Caleb's skin prickled. "You want in?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Why would you want in?" He looked at the shed. It was old, patched with mismatched pieces of metal, a place he mostly used for tools he didn't want in the barn. Shovels, fence posts, old feed bins. It wasn't locked, but the latch sometimes stuck. Caleb put his hand on the latch. Juniper shoved her shoulder into him, impatient, pushing him closer to the door like she couldn't wait. Caleb frowned. All right. He lifted the latch. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder, feeling the rusted metal fight him. Juniper head-butted the door lightly, right beside his hand, like she was trying to help. Caleb jerked back. "Hey, don't crack my fingers, you menace!" Juniper didn't care about his fingers. She stamped once, bleated again, and stared at the crack at the bottom of the shed. Caleb followed her gaze, and that's when he noticed the second thing. A sound. Not the goat's bleating. Something faint from inside the shed. A soft, rhythmic scrape, and then a whimper. Caleb froze. His hand stayed on the latch, suddenly cold. "Hello?" he called, voice cautious. "Is someone in there?" No answer, just that faint whimper again. Caleb's heartbeat kicked hard. He lived on a quiet patch of land outside of town. People didn't just end up in his shed. The only things that belonged in there were tools and dust and spiders. He tried the latch again with both hands. It still wouldn't open. Juniper let out a frantic bleat and rammed the door with her shoulder, not full force, but enough that Caleb felt the vibration. "Okay," Caleb breathed, a different kind of fear creeping in now. "Okay, something's in there." He glanced around. His dog, Hank, was barking from the porch, sensing the tension. The barn cats watched from the fence line, tails twitching. Caleb ran to the barn, grabbed a crowbar from the tool rack, and sprinted back. Juniper was still at the door, now pawing at the bottom, snorting like she wanted to dig through it. Caleb wedged the crowbar into the gap near the latch and leaned his weight into it. The metal groaned. The door shuddered. Then, with a sharp pop, the latch gave way. Caleb yanked the door open, and the world went silent. Not just his voice. Everything. Juniper stopped bleeding. Hank stopped barking. Even the distant crows in the trees seemed to pause. Because inside the shed wasn't what Caleb expected. There were no raccoons, no stray dogs, no trapped cat. There was a small pile of hay in the corner. And in that hay, curled tight against the cold metal wall, was a tiny baby goat. A kid. Newborn. Maybe a day old, maybe less. Still damp in places, fur clumped, body shivering. Its eyes were open but dull, and its legs were tucked under it as if it didn't have the strength to stand. Caleb's mouth went dry. "What?" he whispered, stepping closer. "Where did you come from?" The baby let out a weak, thin bleat. Then Caleb saw something else. A second small shape behind it. Another kid. Even smaller, barely moving. Caleb's stomach dropped. "Oh no," he breathed. Juniper pushed past him, stepping into the shed with a confidence that felt almost possessive. She went straight to the kids, lowering her head, sniffing them rapidly. The first kid lifted its head weakly and made a faint sound. Juniper answered with a low, rumbling bleat and began licking the kid's face, quick and frantic strokes. Caleb stared. Juniper wasn't just reacting to random babies. She knew them. And in that instant, Caleb understood something that made his chest tighten. Juniper had been pregnant. He knew that. He'd been watching her belly grow, counting days, preparing a pen in the barn for when she went into labor. But she hadn't delivered in the barn. She hadn't delivered in the pasture. She'd delivered here, in the shed, alone. And then, somehow, overnight, she had been separated from her newborns and locked out. Caleb's brain tried to assemble the missing pieces like a puzzle that didn't want to fit. Had the shed door blown shut during the night? Had the latch stuck from rust? Had Juniper gone in there to give birth and then stepped out, only for the wind to slam the door? Caleb pictured it. Juniper, exhausted after labor, stepping out for water or to call for help, the door closing behind her with a final cruel click. Her baby's inside, cold, trapped. Caleb's hands started to shake. Juniper licked the weaker kid, then nudged it with her nose, pushing it gently like she was trying to make it breathe harder. "Wake up! Live!" Caleb moved quickly, instincts taking over. He stripped off his jacket and knelt beside the kids, careful, gentle. The first kid was cold but responsive. The second one was frighteningly still. Caleb pressed 2 fingers against its tiny chest. A faint heartbeat, so weak he almost missed it. "Okay," Caleb whispered, voice breaking. "Okay, buddy, stay with me." He scooped the smaller kid into his jacket, wrapping it like a fragile package, and stood up. "Juniper," he said softly, "I'm taking them to the barn. Warm, now." Juniper followed immediately, pushing close, bleeding in short, urgent bursts. She didn't fight him. She didn't resist. She just stayed near, watching every step like her body didn't trust the universe anymore. Caleb rushed them to the barn, set the kids under a heat lamp in the kidding pen, and grabbed towels, warm water, and colostrum replacer from his emergency kit. He'd done this before. Helped weak kids, warmed chilled lambs. Farming taught you how quickly life could fade. But this felt different, because the villain wasn't sickness. It was a door, a stupid shed door. Juniper climbed into the pen and stood over the babies, shaking, licking, bleating softly now. Soothing sounds, mother sounds. Caleb rubbed the smaller kid vigorously with a towel, trying to stimulate circulation. The kid's mouth opened, a tiny gasp. "Come on," Caleb whispered. "Breathe, breathe." He warmed colostrum and dripped a few drops onto the kid's lips. The kid didn't suck. Caleb's stomach clenched. He grabbed a syringe and carefully fed a tiny amount, slow enough not to aspirate. Juniper watched with wide eyes, her body leaning forward as if she wanted to do it herself, but didn't know how. "Easy," Caleb murmured to her too. "We're getting you there." Minutes crawled. The kid's body trembled under the towel. Then, suddenly, its jaw moved. Tiny, purposeful. It sucked. Just once. Then again. Caleb felt his own breath shudder out. "Yes," he whispered, laughing and almost crying. "That's it. That's it." Juniper let out a low bleat that sounded like relief collapsing into her lungs. The stronger kid managed to stand on wobbly legs, shaking like a newborn deer. It tried to find Juniper's udder, nosed around awkwardly, then latched. Juniper stood perfectly still, as if she was afraid movement would break the miracle. Caleb kept feeding the weaker one in tiny amounts until it finally began to root and latch too, weak but determined. By the time the sun climbed higher, both kids were under the heat lamp, breathing steadier, their bodies no longer ice-cold. Caleb sat on the straw, elbows on knees, staring at them like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Juniper lay down and curled around them, her head resting near their tiny bodies like a guard. Caleb's throat tightened. "You saved them," he whispered to her. "You know that?" Juniper blinked slowly, then nudged one kid closer to her belly. She didn't need praise. She needed her babies alive. When Caleb finally called his neighbor Darlene, who'd raised goats longer than he'd been alive, she arrived within 20 minutes, hair in a messy bun, boots on, no nonsense. She walked into the barn, took one look at the kids, then at Juniper, then at Caleb. "Well, I'll be damned," she said softly. Caleb exhaled. Door stuck. Babies trapped. Juniper was trying to break it down. Darlene crouched and checked the kids' ears, their gums, their warmth. "They're alive, and that's because that mama refused to quit." Caleb swallowed. "I thought she was just being stubborn." Darlene snorted gently. "Goats are stubborn, sure. But mothers? Mothers are something else." She looked at Juniper, who stared back with steady eyes. Darlene's voice softened. "She knew where they were. She knew she needed you. That's why she headbutted that door until you came." Caleb stared at the shed through the barn window, anger rising. "I should have checked earlier. I should have—" Darlene cut him off with a look. "You came when it mattered. Now fix that latch so it never happens again." Caleb nodded, jaw tight. That afternoon he replaced the shed latch entirely. New hardware, new lock, new hinges. He added a wedge so wind could never slam it shut again, because he couldn't stop picturing those tiny bodies in the cold shed. And Juniper, outside, headbutting wood like her life depended on it. Because it did. The story spread, like small-town stories always do. "How'd the goats survive?" Juniper busted the door down. "No, the farmer did." "No, I heard the goat knocked like a SWAT team." People laughed. Caleb smiled politely, but none of them saw what he'd seen. They hadn't heard the silence when the door opened and revealed something that should have been dead. They hadn't watched Juniper's eyes, wild with panic, focused like a laser, while she begged with her whole body. They hadn't felt the brutal truth of it, that sometimes the line between life and death is a stuck latch and 10 minutes. A week later, the kids were stronger. They bounced around the pen, little springs on legs. Caleb's daughter, who visited on weekends, named them Bolt and Pip, because one was fast and the other was small but stubborn. Juniper followed them everywhere, calmer now, but always checking, always counting. One evening, Caleb sat on a hay bale, watching Juniper nurse both kids. He thought about how ridiculous he'd felt at first, yelling at a goat for headbutting a shed. He thought about how easily he could have ignored it, how easily he could have said, "She'll stop." And he realized that the loudest cries for help weren't always cries. Sometimes they were a mother turning her forehead into a battering ram. Sometimes they were hooves scraping at a door. Sometimes they were persistence so relentless it forced the world to pay attention. Juniper lifted her head and looked at Caleb. Her eyes were calmer now, but there was still something in them, something he couldn't unsee. Not just animal instinct, something closer to intention. Caleb stood, walked to the pen, and leaned on the fence quietly. Juniper didn't move away. She just watched him for a moment, then lowered her head and licked one kid's ear gently. Caleb smiled, throat tight. "Yeah," he whispered, "I hear you now." And from that day on, every time Caleb heard a strange sound on his property, every thump, every scrape, every bleat that didn't match the usual chorus, he didn't dismiss it. He went to look. Because once you've opened a door and found the truth on the other side, you never ignore a knock again.